Because at this point, when I watch other media, I'm actually watching it not just as a consumer, but as a creator as
You're
well.
scouting now.
I really am. It's
Yeah.
interesting how that perspective changes because all of a sudden I'm watching XYZ podcast and I'm looking at what they're doing, how they're sitting, what they're saying, how the show flows. And there's more produced shows and then there are more laid back shows. And to your point earlier, kind of how the conversation ebb and flows, where they take the conversation, how the conversation sometimes comes to like an abrupt halt and they have to kind of get it going again. So it's
By the
really
way,
interesting.
does it make you worried that some of these guys are getting in trouble for bits that they did like 5, 10, 15 years ago? Like, does that worry you? Because like we had 2 instances this week. One of them was Joe Rogan, obviously
Yeah.
the talk of the podcast world.
Right.
And the other one was Jimmy Kimmel, right?
Kimmel, yeah, and not
And
just
the
Kimmel,
Man
but
Show.
Man Show, but other other comedian. This kind of hit comedians heavy as far as
Yeah.
I feel like comedians as a whole try to push that envelope. To borrow Charlie Murphy's line, they're habitual line steppers, right? They're constantly on that.
Comedy is a suspension of belief, right? Like when you walk into a comedy show. It's like when you listen to Eminem, like you don't really think that he's going to kill his wife, put her in the trunk and drive her off a cliff.
You would hope, right?
But you suspend belief and you listen to the album and you kind of try to get in his mentality in his head,
Correct.
Knowing that like the man, Marshall Mathers is not going to do that.
Right. Right.
It's the same thing with comedy. Like these comedians are very good at delivering something that feels like they would really feel that way, but they're not really saying that they're going to do these things. And so it puts the comedy world in this great debate right now of like, look, everyone's so sensitive. People are getting hung up for things they did 9 years ago. Like in Joe Rogan's case, he didn't even say anything.
Yeah,
he just was complicit
he was just there.
He was laughing at a situation that was obviously inappropriate, but on a show that's very inappropriate all the time. Like it's not like all of a sudden he was on KFI and then things got inappropriate and he condoned it, right? This man is a comedian. He's been on shows. He has his own show. He does inappropriate shit for a living. Like, why are we holding him to a standard 9 years later? So does that like worry you as somebody who's releasing media that's been going to have a digital footprint, if you will, for a long period of time?
So I think yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the internet has shown that this stuff lives forever. So regardless of what you put out there, it's just out there. And now people you and I had a conversation now about, somebody chopping this up and making us look terrible, right? Like you totally cut it up in a way where all of a sudden I didn't say that, or, so yes, there is a little bit of apprehension there, but I also think that as long as you're genuine and true, it is what it is, right? You can only be yourself. And so I think that's really what you try to lean heavy in, or you lean into, is just yourself. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is what I think. I also think we're in this weird time where the lens through which we all culturally looked at things is shifting. You see this with like
super magnified,
right?
And
not just that, you see it with like not just what's happening in the comedy world, that you see it also with like all the protests that were continued. They continue. They haven't stopped. Maybe not with the same veracity as earlier in the month, but definitely they're still around. They're still actively engaged in that activity. They've added now taking down statues to what they're doing, as well, as far as bringing attention to these things. So I think that. And the idea behind, for example, pulling down the statues is, are we celebrating somebody that are a heritage or an idea that we no longer agree with, right? Maybe we no longer see things that way. And so that monument, that statue that once was held in high esteem or put up there for whatever reason, obviously a statue is usually kind of to commemorate something. That's my understanding. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, and I think that culturally, like 2020 has been an interesting year in that everything is shifting, and it's shifting quickly and in real time, right? It's happening as we're like living it. It's not like exactly. It's not like down the road there's some
it's
benchmark.
Not like, hey, there's a plan to like knock down a statue. It's like, no, we're going down there, we're taking it down this
right. Or in the
that's
comedy,
a good point though. So when a statue is toppled, right, in an American city, are we saying culturally that this was a bad person, that we don't like this person? Or are we saying this statue is somewhat complicit with a movement that we no longer accept? So like if George Washington was a slave owner and we say George Washington, because he was a slave owner, we're taking down that statue, it has nothing to do with the Confederate flag or whatever. Are we saying as a society that George Washington is a bad dude now? Or are we saying we just don't want reminders of slavery in our everyday? Like, it's not something I want to walk by on my way to the donut shop.
That's an interesting question, man. I think it. So I'll give you my take, kind of like my perspective, because I really don't know what the collective is thinking.
Obviously, you can't
Right.
speak for like
For the
every
collective,
American
right? But
who's
for
ripping
me,
down
it would
statues.
be, for example, maybe that statue is better served in a museum, for example, right? Maybe that statue is used as a teaching tool, because a lot of times people harp on the idea, well, that's our history, and to a certain extent, they're 100% right. That is something that happened. That is using George Washington, for example, that is an individual that played a significant role in the development of this country.
Yeah.
So, but maybe to your point, the ideals or the lifestyle or what was accepted in his time no longer coincides with what we culturally agree to is the norm now, or it was not the norm actually, because it's changing. So, but what was culturally accepted, I'll leave it at that. What was culturally accepted at one point maybe is no longer the case today. And so potentially maybe we shift that monument, that statue, whatever, from one place to another, as far as like this goes now into like a museum or some kind of heritage memorial or something where that history lives on, but there's a caveat of there was more to this person than just maybe the folklore or the stories that you're told. This was a complicated individual living in a complicated time, and so because of that, we remember them. We talk about them. We don't ignore it, right? We don't pretend like George Washington didn't exist, but there's also context that's provided that maybe just having a fountain in the middle of a park with a guy on top of a horse doesn't necessarily convey, right? Maybe there's additional information provided.
But the difference being that George Washington isn't, well, I guess, would people in historically now, when we look back, will we say George Washington was a good guy who just happened to be a slave owner, and we don't like the fact that he owned slaves, so we're going to relegate his statues to a museum instead of a public place? Because like, if you go into Germany, like I saw somebody post this and I thought it was kind of eye-opening for me. If you go into Germany, there's not like Nazi flags up because it was their history. There's no Nazi leaders that are in public statue
revered,
form.
right? That are like,
they're not revered, but then again, everyone in Germany kind of agrees like, that was stupid. Like that's not us. We don't.
That was a bad look all the way around.
That was a bad look for all of us. And so we're not gonna fly flags and hang statues. So I guess it's just so nuanced in America, because in Germany it's clear cut. It's like, we're not Nazis.
No,
we don't want to be associated with that.
At all, right.
It's totally a changing of the guard. But in America, it's like, this dude was big in founding the country, and a lot of these guys were, and their fathers were slave owners, and their neighbors were slave owners, and they just were doing whatever it took to run their plantation. And obviously we know now that's not our look. That's not the look that we were going for. But it's very difficult to say that's a bad dude, because I mean, I guess, do you agree with that? Is that just a bad dude because he decided to own slaves?
I think it's more complicated than that. I don't like I've said before, I think there's levels, right? It's not on off, yes, no, black, white kind of thing. I think there's levels, like that he played a key role in the foundation of this country, right? Mm-hmm. And if you believe in this country, well, then there's some good in that, right? But also there were some other things, for example, like slave ownership, where I find it difficult to believe that on some level they didn't know what they were doing was, I think it was wrong.
How does it not hit that moral trigger?
Correct. Like how do you own a human being? Correct. Like how do you own a human being and are okay with it? Because of the time that I live in.
Because everyone else is doing it? Is that good enough?
I don't know. Like, that's what I'm saying. It's hard for me to put myself in that mind state and try to encompass that man's shoes and what he was living and going through and everything. Yeah. But in 2020 today, with everything going on and the world that I've grown up in, it just seems like such a foreign concept, right? The idea of, although to be fair, I'm sure it happens still to this day, right? There's still maybe not as pronounced and maybe not as exposed out there into the light, but human trafficking, slavery, there are still things that are very much real, not to the extent,
just not in broad daylight.
Correct. Not like in the manner that it was back then, but it's definitely. So I don't know. Is he a bad dude? like not knowing, I guess that's part of why I would say the context is so important, right?
Yeah.
I really don't know much about George Washington beyond what I learned in school, right? I've never I've never done like a book report or watched the George Washington story or something
That'll
like
be
that.
next week, folks. We're doing book reports and we're monitoring the plants'
Right,
growth
exactly.
activity.
So there's nothing there that I can hang my hat on. Up like, no, this was a fantastic dude. Now, the one question that you did bring up, which I find really interesting, is that this country has this weird reverence to essentially an enemy combatant within its own populace that lost the war. And
Well,
you know
I
what I
will
mean?
say a part of this country does,
Part,
because
okay, no, exactly. No, there's a
so
part of
I'm
the
born and
country
raised in
that,
California, and I've
yeah,
never seen a Confederate flag that had any sort of that made me feel at home. You know, it's
right.
not like I was like, oh hell yeah, like that was part of our. No, it wasn't. It wasn't a part of my history. Like
Hmm.
it's in my mind. It's, but yeah, like you said, like you started. Well, you didn't start. It was a thing, and you fought for that thing, and you lost that thing, and it has gotten progressively, further from our normal behavior. So why are you still? What does the
Yeah,
flag mean anymore? Like
correct. And
it's
does that
just
and whatever and everything that's tied to that flag and why they fought that war, right? There was a lot of underlying things, but slavery was more or less at the forefront of it. So,
mhm.
is the idea that you're promoting this flag also that you're in line with that type of thinking? That's
It's
always
like the
kind of
colonial
that's
flag,
kind of
right?
like
Like, okay, so you know
I
the
don't know.
flag with like the 13 stars, like
Right,
the
right,
original 13
yeah,
colonies. Like you see the colonial flag in colonial states, the original 13 colonies, and you're like, okay, that makes sense. Like you're touting the fact that you're an original 13, United States country. And but there's no stigma with that. You weren't wrong in doing that. I mean, you were, if anything, you were a revolutionary in doing that. But the Confederate flag is different. That
yeah,
represents something that we have moved on
totally
from.
different, right?
This is a terrible idea, and nationally we recognize it as a terrible idea. And I just think that, sadly, I feel like we're going to probably go way political here, but I feel like our current president kind of brings that out in people. Like I think that was hiding. Um, it wasn't such a in plain sight thing, but now it's like I feel empowered to bust out my Confederate flag and throw it on my truck and drive down the street. And so I hope that this is an eye-opening experience that gets people to think like, can we just get over this stupid flag and move on? Like it's not, the statues, you could argue, are a little bit more
I think it's more
historical
deep
because it's
rooted
more
than, man.
nuanced.
I think it's,
But the
yeah.
flag is a throwaway. Like get rid of it. It's, to me, it's not American history that we wanna revere.
I'm with you. I just think it's such a deep rooted part of certain parts of this country. Like it's
Yeah,
one of
and I
those
guess
things
maybe
where,
we don't understand that,
and
and
being on the
maybe we
West
never
Coast,
will.
I think being on the West Coast, it is something that's a little more difficult for us to
Maybe we should
understand.
just shut up and stick to the left coast and
No, but I mean,
not try to
it is,
understand these people.
but it is I think trying to gain an understanding is powerful in the sense of, you try to put yourself in the other people's shoes and see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
At the same time, doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it. Like, but like I said, I find it weird because at the end of the day, they lost the war. It'd be like, for example, if this country was still under the control of the English, right, of Britain,
Yeah.
but yet they allowed the American flag to be flown everywhere. Even though they lost the war, let's just say the United States never wins the Revolutionary War, it's
Right.
still occupied by the British, so it's still a
Right.
British colony. But yet, do you think that the Brits would allow you to just freely fly that flag? The answer probably is no. Like they'd want to eradicate that and get rid of it. It's
Yeah. That's a
interesting
good
how
point.
this country allowed that to just kind of be there and
Yeah.
allowed it to just continue
Or
to.
maybe it's just because they never took it down. Like year over year, they just never. They're like, hey,
They just left it
we're
up.
proud of the fact that we lost, and we're gonna fly this flag proudly. And then we're like 200, some years
Something
later,
years
going,
later, yeah. Like,
why
what
is
are we
the
doing
flag
here?
still up? What
Yeah.
the hell?
So I don't know. I
So
think it's an interesting time though, because I think the fact that these conversations are being had is the progress, right?
yeah,
You didn't have these conversations before. They were just there. The flag is there. The statues are
yeah.
there. The
Just,
monuments are there.
if you
But
don't
now
like
that
it, avert your eyes. The flag
Correct.
stays.
But now the fact that we're having these conversations, I think that is part of the progress. The fact that we're challenging ourselves and being like, well, wait a second, why are these things here? And do
Right.
we agree with them being
It's a
here? Do
good
we want them
challenge. We
here?
should think
Right.
about this.
Exactly. This is something that, I think for all of us, it's a good thought experiment, and it allows you to explore. Like I said, to be honest, I never really thought about the flag too much. The Confederate flag, like when as a matter of fact, when I think of the Confederate flag, I think of Dukes of Hazzard. To be honest, that's my seriously, because that's my exposure to it, right? Like I
That's
grew up as
about
a
right.
kid
Yeah.
watching the show, and that's where I saw the stars and bars. That's really, I've never lived in the South. I've never hung out there. I've never had like life experience there, so
Right.
I'm not familiar with that and all of that brings, right? Like some other
Yeah.
folks. So I think that's where those deep rooted sentiments come from. So just a thought. But let me ask you this: as far as we see everything changing, and this kind of directly ties into the flag. What did you think about NASCAR finally taking a stand and being like, no more flags at our events, no more being associated with this particular symbol?
So I grew up watching NASCAR. It was one of my two sports that I grew up watching.
Yeah.
NASCAR is one of those sports where you either grew up watching it or you don't like it, because if you don't understand the nuances of what's going on the racetrack, and more importantly, the storylines around the characters, there's 43 guys on the racetrack, or, could be women on the racetrack at any given point. Shout out to Danica Patrick. And they're just going around in circles. They're making four left turns 400 times. Like, how is that interesting to anybody who doesn't understand the nuances of the sport,
right?
The what goes on in the pits, what strategy is around fueling. So, but when you grow up on it and you watch, 30 some races a year, then all of a sudden you're kind of ingrained in the culture. So I grew up watching NASCAR. Love NASCAR I think I told you this before. When I was in college, I used to record every race, and I used to watch every single race.
You're the only dude that
every
I know.
single minute of every single race.
Of.
And by the way, this is the only sport when I was in college that you can record and watch the result 4 days later and nobody would spoil it for you. Like, you couldn't do that with any other sport, because no one gave a shit about NASCAR.
Nobody was watching that, bro.
And you wouldn't even see maybe every once in a while you'd see the ticker on ESPN.
Right, exactly, on Sports Center.
Maybe, but for the most part, I could. There was no spoilers for 4 days of NASCAR. So to see how NASCAR has everything else is progressing, and NASCAR is kind of like the old times. Like, it kind of got left in the dust.
Yeah.
And they've tried a couple reboots on the scoring and what happens to the points.
They introduced like the chase,
playoff.
There's
a chase. There's a playoff system. There's an even more complicated playoff system now. I stopped watching. I lost interest. I just couldn't keep with all the rule changes. For me, I was like more of a purist that was totally cool with the 26 race kind of pre-qualifier and the 10 race finals, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And they just made it too messy for me, so I eventually lost interest. But to answer your question, I was super bummed I was super happy to see that NASCAR finally was moving on from this Confederate flag, because if anybody would have a tough time with this, it'd be NASCAR, just because their whole sport is based in Charlotte, and it's a very Southern sport in general. The biggest crowds show up in Southern towns to watch, any stock car race, not just NASCAR. So there's more of a culture there than, let's say, here or in a northern Pacific Northwest state, for instance. So they make this big push. They ban the Confederate flag. One of the leaders of banning the Confederate flag is Bubba Wallace, who's he's an African American driver.
I think he's the only one, right?
He's the only current African American driver.
Right?
There's been African American pro kind of NASCAR drivers in the past, but Bubba is the only present one. And then immediately, how does NASCAR idiot respond was by putting a noose in his garage, which obviously made the press on Sunday, when they were supposed to race. But then I was pleasantly surprised. By the way, I'm glad we didn't shoot the show.
Yeah,
on
no,
Sunday,
totally different story, right? Yeah,
because now the story is so here's everything that happened from the noose incident. Makes me very happy with how the sport did it. And I think my biggest takeaway from this story is hardly anybody knew about the noose. Like, one NASCAR official and one of Bubba's team officials found the noose, gave it to a NASCAR official. Literally 2 people in America knew about the noose.
Mm-hmm.
And so the NASCAR official that was privy to the story obviously went to his boss and said, hey, this happened. Like, it's right on the doorstep of us trying to eradicate the Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. What do we do with this? So all the brass of NASCAR got in a room, and they said, what do you want to do with this? Do we want to – they actually brought it up. They said, do we want to kill the story and make it go away, and maybe no one ever finds out about this and it's not a black eye in our sport? Or do we want to take this thing head on and basically do the right thing, in my opinion, and say, this happened, it's another bad incident, but we're going to respond we're going to do a full investigation. We'll find the culprit. There's only so many people that could go in this garage right now because of COVID and because of all these other things. So it's not a needle in the haystack like it would have been last year, let's say. And they do the right thing and they publicize the story on their own account, meaning this wasn't leaked by anybody else in the press.
They came out on their own and
they wore it. They came out. There was a huge showing of support for Bubba. Richard Petty, who's 82 years old, flies in for the race yesterday. It's basically, he tweeted that I'm flying in, even though I'm old and like we talked about before, he's a COVID demographic, right? He's supposed to be at home, but he flew in because he wanted to hug his driver, and I thought that was a great message. There was a great showing of solidarity. They pushed Bubba's car down pit road, and he was so celebrated the whole day. There was Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the stands and after the race in Talladega. He had a good run. He could have won the race, but he ran out of fuel, which is one of those like, why did you run out of fuel? Like as a non-NASCAR fan, you're like, how the hell do you run out of fuel? Your only job is
more fuel in the car. It's very
right.
simple.
The only job is to keep your tank full. And you run out. Like I don't even run out of fuel, and I'm not a race car driver. But what he said after the race, like everything that's happened since the noose is perfect for the sport. Viewership was up yesterday. Black viewership was up yesterday. Now, will they stay? Probably not. I mean, this is kind of going to be a flash in the pan for the sport. Eventually, they're going to tune in next week and be like, oh, look, they're turning left 1,600 times. Like, it's the same thing that we saw last week, right? Yeah, I think Bubba will get more fans, which is great for him. Right. But I'm excited to see everything that happened after Sunday. I think NASCAR and their new regime, by the way, there was an old guard of NASCAR that kind of walked away / they parted ways from a couple years back, and the new leadership is much like the NBA leadership with Silver, where it's like everything in everyone's opinion, in the court of public opinion, everything that Adam Silver does for the NBA is like spot on. Like the dude hasn't missed since Donald Sterling was an idiot and ended up with the team being taken away from him. So
did you hear the news today though, that the noose was not necessarily put there, and that like there was this thing, I don't know if you maybe saw it because it just came out right before we started recording. The FBI says the noose in Bubba Wallace's garage was a misunderstanding over a door pull rope that had been there since October 2009 and no crime was committed. So I guess if
that's really true, then even better. Exactly. Because they own the story that they didn't even know what the outcome was. And if that's really the case, then there's not some racist idiot running around and backstage at a NASCAR race. Then that makes me even happier. I hope they didn't do all this for publicity, but if they did, like that's a pretty elaborate.
I think it's kind of to your point. I think they owned it. And then having done a full investigation, because this is the FBI's findings, right? This is what the FBI reported.
Because everyone trusts the FBI.
Yeah, well, another story for another day.
Works so well in other
they said that they found evidence that Wallace was not a victim of hate crime and no charges would be filed. So essentially, it seems like it was just a door pull that.
So there is no guilty party here.
No. It looks like this was something that was there.
Breaking news, people! The plant has grown during our show, and the noose was unintentional.
The news was there for a while, so it wasn't necessarily like a deliberate or a predetermined attack or message being sent. It was more like this was there. It broke off. They kind of put it to the side, and then it was found. That's kind of the gist that I'm getting. And this is just news, like I said, that came out maybe about like 6:30, 7 o'clock. So right before we started shooting.
Thanks for the update.
So, yeah. So but I mean, I think it's awesome. Your point being that this wasn't something that NASCAR shied away from, especially how it could be contextualized as, oh, we take this hardline stance on the flag, and then 2 days later or 3 days later or whatever the time frame is, all of a sudden our one African-American driver finds a noose in his garage. Like, oh my God.
And right? Bubba was a huge part of the stance on the Confederate flag. So they, regardless of the outcome of this investigation, made a great decision to just own it and just say, like, we're going to support this guy. We're all going to support this guy. So that was a really good outcome.